She was just the girl who poured the water, a shadow in a red apron, a nobody, or so the city of Chicago believed. The night the Lion of Sicily, Don Ricci Matteo, stepped into Waitress, the oxygen vanished from the room. Men who ran the Chicago docks and controlled the unions were suddenly wiping sweat from their brows. But when the shy waitress approached the center table, her hand didn't shake. She didn't look at the floor. She looked the most feared man in the Midwest dead in the eye and spoke 5 words in a mountain dialect that hadn't been spoken since the Valent bloodline was supposedly wiped out in the 90s. The restaurant didn't just go quiet, it turned to ice, because that wasn't a greeting. It was a declaration of war. This is the story of Lucia, the waitress who was hiding a blood-soaked throne beneath her server's uniform. The dinner rush at Waitress was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Located in the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, the restaurant was a fortress of mahogany, candlelight, and secrets. It was the kind of place where a single tip could pay a month's rent, but one wrong look could get you buried in the foundations of a new skyscraper. Lucia Bellini pulled her dark hair into a bun so tight it hurt. She looked at her reflection in the chrome of the industrial fridge. She saw a tired girl in a white shirt and a red apron. Perfect. She looked like a ghost. She looked forgettable. Bellini stopped daydreaming and get water to the VIP booth. Now, the floor manager, a man who lived in fear of his own shadow, hissed in her ear. "Yes, sir," Lucia whispered, keeping her chin tucked. For 3 years, she had mastered the art of being a shadow in the Windy City. She paid her rent in cash in a crumbling Cicero apartment and never stayed in the same park for more than 10 minutes. Invisibility was her armor, but tonight, the air in the restaurant felt like a storm was breaking. The kitchen staff wasn't joking around. The head chef was personally inspecting every plate with trembling fingers. "What's going on?" Lucia asked a busp as they crossed paths. "The owner cleared the whole mezzanine," he whispered, his face pale. "The Matteos are here." The old man brought his son. Lucia felt a cold spark of fire ignite in her chest, the righteous indignation she had spent years burying. The men who destroyed her family were finally sitting at her table. The golden light of Waitress didn't just illuminate the room, it felt like it was judging everyone in it. In the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, the restaurant functioned as a cathedral of excess, where the clink of crystal and the low murmur of million-dollar deals created a constant, vibrating hum. For Lucia Bellini, this hum was her shield. She moved through the dining room like a ghost, a blur of white linen and red cotton that nobody bothered to look at twice. To the titans of industry and the politicians who frequented her tables, she was merely an extension of the furniture, a silent, obedient vessel for water and wine. Lucia stopped by the service station, her hands moving with practiced, mechanical precision as she filled a glass pitcher with ice. She caught her reflection in the polished mahogany paneling and felt a brief, hollow pang of success. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, so severe it masked the elegance of her bone structure. Her oversized uniform swallowed the grace of her posture. This was her masterpiece, a 3-year performance of utter insignificance. In the shadows of Cicero, she was a survivor paying rent in wrinkled $5 bills. Here, she was just Bellini, the girl who never looked up. Suddenly, the hum of the room didn't just fade, it vanished. The silence wasn't gradual, it was a sudden, violent vacuum that made the ears pop. The heavy oak doors of the foyer swung open, and the air in the restaurant grew cold. Don Ricci Matteo stepped into the light, his presence carrying the weight of a dying sun. He was a silver-haired specter in a black suit that looked carved from shadows, his dark sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. Every step he took, aided by a silver lion-headed cane that clicked against the marble floor like a ticking clock, seemed to demand an apology from the world for existing. Behind him stood Vitale, the sharp, modern edge to his father's old-world blunt force. Vitale was a predator in charcoal gray, his neck tattoos peeking out from a pristine collar like bared teeth. He didn't look at the guests. He surveyed them, his gaze heavy with the bored menace of a man who knew he could destroy anyone in the room before the appetizers arrived. The floor manager, Mr. Henderson, looked as though he might collapse. He scurried forward, his face a mask of sweating desperation. "Don Ricci, what an unexpected honor. Your table is ready, of course. The mezzanine is yours." Lucia's grip tightened on the ice pitcher until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She felt the ghost she had created beginning to fray at the edges. A primal, electric heat radiated from the center of the room, drawing all eyes toward the Matteo table. The kitchen staff, usually a riot of shouting and clattering pans, was suddenly moving in a synchronized panic attack, plating dishes with trembling fingers as if they were handling live grenades. Lucia forced her breath to remain shallow and even. She tucked her chin, adjusted her red apron, and stepped into the vacuum. She had spent 1,000 nights practicing how to be invisible, but as she approached the table where the men who had erased her past now sat, she realized that some fires are too hot to stay buried. She wasn't just bringing them water, she was walking into the mouth of the wolf. The transition from the floor to the mezzanine felt like climbing the gallows. Lucia carried the crystal pitcher on a silver tray, her footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rugs. At the center table, the air was different. It was heavy, tasting of expensive tobacco and a cold, predatory stillness. Don Ricci sat like an ancient king carved from granite, his gloved hand resting atop his lion-headed cane. Beside him, Vitale leaned back, his eyes tracking Lucia's movement with a sharp, unsettling focus, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't seen in years. Lucia reached the table and began to pour. Her hand was steady, a feat of sheer will that contradicted the hammering of her heart against her ribs. She kept her gaze fixed on the rim of the glass, watching the water rise, careful not to let a single drop spill onto the white damask cloth. She was nearly finished when the old man spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Look at this one, Vitale," Don Ricci murmured, not in English, but in a harsh, guttural Sicilian dialect, a mountain tongue used by the rugged shepherds of the interior to mock the weak. "She moves like a frightened lamb in a room full of wolves, too soft for this city, a little sheep born only to be slaughtered for the Sunday feast." Vitale let out a short, dry chuckle, his eyes never leaving Lucia's face. "The city is full of sheep, Papa. They are only useful until they are hungry, then they are a nuisance." Lucia felt the familiar, searing heat of the Valent blood rising in her throat. For 3 years, she had swallowed every insult, every snap of a finger, and every dismissive glance. But to hear the dialect of her father, the tongue of a proud, fallen house, used to call her a sacrifice was too much. The ghost didn't just fray, it disintegrated. She didn't retreat, she didn't bow. Instead, she set the pitcher down with a deliberate, melodic clink that cut through the silence like a gunshot. Lucia straightened her spine, her shoulders squaring until she stood with the poise of a woman who had once owned the ground she walked on. She looked directly into Don Ricci's hidden eyes, her gaze as sharp and cold as an alpine winter. She spoke then, her voice clear and resonant, responding in that same archaic, rhythmic dialect, the high code of the Sicilian interior that even most modern bosses had forgotten. "The sheep that survives, Don Ricci," she said, each word dripping with a quiet, lethal authority, "is the one that stays awake to watch the wolf sleep. And when the wolf finally closes his eyes, the sheep discovers it has the heart of a lion." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. Don Ricci's hand froze on his cane, his knuckles turning white. Vitale sat bolt upright, his face stripping away its mask of boredom to reveal a raw, jagged shock. Across the room, the other diners felt the sudden drop in temperature, though they couldn't understand the words. Only the three of them knew that the shy waitress had just pulled a metaphorical blade. Lucia didn't wait for a reaction. She gave a curt, mocking nod of her head, the nod of an equal. Not a servant, and turned on her heel. She walked away through the frozen gallery of guests, leaving the most dangerous men in Chicago staring at the back of a woman they had just realized was a ghost come back to life. The adrenaline didn't hit all at once. It rolled in like a Chicago winter storm, freezing Lucia's lungs before turning her blood to fire. She didn't look back as she pushed through the heavy kitchen doors, ignoring the frantic whispers of the staff. She stripped off the red apron in a single motion, revealing the black leggings she always wore beneath her uniform, her insurance policy for a night she had prayed would never come. Within seconds, she was out the service exit and into the biting chill of the alleyway, the iron scent of the city filling her senses. Behind her, the heavy thud of the door being kicked open echoed against the brick walls. She went south. A voice barked, sharp, young, and lethal. It wasn't the police. It was the Matteo's cleanup crew, the men who turned accidents into urban legends. Lucia bolted, her boots hammered against the wet pavement as she sprinted toward the glowing skeleton of the Wells Street Bridge. The city was a maze of light and shadow, but she knew every crack in the sidewalk. She didn't head for the crowded streets, she headed up. The rusted iron stairs of the L station groaned under her weight as she took them 3 at a time. Above her, the platform hummed with the electric tension of an approaching train. She swiped her card with trembling fingers and cleared the turnstile just as the brown line train roared into the station, a serpent of steel and glass. She ducked into the last car, her chest heaving, her eyes scanning the platform. Through the closing doors, she saw him, Vitale. He wasn't running. He was walking with a terrifying, predatory calm, his charcoal suit a silhouette against the city lights. He locked eyes with her just as the doors hissed shut. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. As the train lurched forward, pulling away into the heart of the loop, Lucia didn't sit down. She moved through the cars, her mind racing faster than the wheels on the tracks. She knew the Matteos controlled the hubs. If she stayed on until the end of the line, she was a dead woman. The train screeched around a tight curve, the skyscrapers of the financial district leaning in like giants. Lucia watched the blur of the city, waiting for the moment the train slowed at the sharp bend near Quincy. She moved to the emergency release, her hand hovering over the lever. The physical stakes were no longer about a job or a secret. They were written in the cold steel of the tracks below and the men she knew would be waiting at the next stop. She saw the black SUVs idling on the street level below, keeping pace with the train. They were herding her. Vitale was playing with his prey, driving her toward a dead end where the ghost of Lucia Valent would finally be laid to rest. But as the train slowed for the turn, Lucia pulled the lever. The hiss of air was a scream of defiance. She didn't wait for the world to stop. She stepped out into the darkness of the elevated tracks, the wind whipping her hair loose from its bun, finally ready to stop running and start fighting. The transition from the elevated tracks to the industrial belly of the city was a descent into a forgotten world. Lucia moved through the skeletal remains of the Chicago Ship Canal, where the air tasted of salt, rust, and stagnant water. Here, the glittering lights of the Gold Coast were a distant, mocking memory. The silence of the shipyard was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic slapping of the black water against the rotted pilings. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, a dark finger pointing toward her past. She reached an abandoned warehouse, its corrugated metal skin scarred by decades of Chicago winters. This was the place her father had called the Anchor. It was a graveyard of the Valent legacy, a site where the blood of her kin had once been traded for the silence of the city. Lucia approached a rusted shipping container tucked into the deepest corner of the yard, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of a familiar mark etched into the steel, a stylized wolf's head, nearly worn away by oxidation. With a strength born of desperation, she pried back a loose panel near the floor. Her breath hitched as she reached into the hollow space, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of a steel briefcase. She pulled it out, the weight of it nearly dragging her to the ground. Inside was the Libro Rosso, the Red Book. It wasn't just a ledger, it was a map of every sin committed by the 5 families over the last 30 years. It held the names of judges who had been bought, politicians who had been blackmailed, and the exact coordinates of the bodies the Matteos had buried to build their throne. She knelt in the dirt, the moonlight filtering through the cracked skylights above like silver bars. This book was her inheritance. It was the only thing that could turn a waitress into a queen, and the only thing that could ensure she wouldn't live the rest of her life as a ghost. As she clutched the briefcase to her chest, the cold metal bit into her skin, a reminder of the debt her father had left behind, a debt that was about to be paid in full. The sound of a lone pebble skittering across the concrete floor froze the blood in her veins. Lucia didn't move, her senses heightening until she could hear the distant hum of the city. She wasn't alone. The shipyard, which had felt like a sanctuary moments ago, was now a cage. She realized then that the quest wasn't just about finding the book. It was about whether she was strong enough to keep it. The scent of expensive cologne, the same one that had filled the mezzanine at Waitress, drifted through the damp air. It's a heavy burden for such small hands, isn't it? The voice came from the shadows, smooth and lethal. Lucia didn't tremble. She stood up, the red book held firmly at her side, her eyes searching the darkness for the glint of charcoal grey. The hunt had led them to the water's edge, and Lucia knew that in the canal, only the things that were weighted stayed submerged. She prepared herself to be the weight that would finally pull the Matteo empire under. Vitale stepped from the darkness, the moonlight catching the jagged ink of the tattoos on his neck. He looked at the steel briefcase in Lucia's hand, then back at her face, his expression unreadable. "My father spent 20 years looking for that box," he said quietly. "He thought your father burned it before the end. You've been sitting on a nuclear winter, Lucia Valent." Lucia didn't retreat. She held the briefcase like a shield. It wasn't for him. It was for the day the Matteos finally pushed too far. That day was tonight. Vitale took a step forward, but before he could speak, the silence of the shipyard was shattered. The rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire tore through the corrugated metal walls of the warehouse. Glass from the high skylights rained down like diamonds. Vitale didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his weight slamming into Lucia and driving her behind a heavy industrial generator just as a line of bullets stitched across the concrete where she had been standing. "Those aren't my father's men," Vitale hissed, his hand reaching into his coat and pulling a sleek, black handgun. "How can you be sure?" Lucia gasped, the air knocked out of her. "Because they're using armor-piercing rounds, and they're aiming for my head too," Vitale replied, his jaw tight. He peered over the edge of the generator. Through the haze of dust, Lucia saw silhouettes moving with military precision, men in tactical gear, not the silk-suited goons of the Gold Coast. "Rocco," Lucia whispered. The name tasted like ash. Rocco was the shadow behind the throne, the man who handled the Matteo's ledgers. "He's cleaning the slate," Vitale realized, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "He kills the last Valent, he kills the Matteo heir, and he uses that book to blackmail everyone else into silence. He's not just taking the throne, he's burning the kingdom so he can rule the ashes." A grenade thudded onto the floor 20 feet away. "Move," Vitale roared. He grabbed Lucia by the arm, dragging her toward the back exit as the explosion rocked the warehouse, sending a shockwave of heat and debris into their backs. They stumbled out into the cold air of the canal, pinned between the water and the killers closing in. Vitale turned, firing 3 measured shots to suppress the mercenaries emerging from the smoke. He looked at Lucia, then at the Libro Rosso, clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The predator was gone, replaced by a man who realized he was just as expendable as the girl he had been hunting. "You want my family dead," Vitale said, his breath hitching in the cold. "And right now. I want to live. If we stay separate, they kill us both and take the book. If we move together, we might make it to dawn." Lucia looked at the hand he held out, the hand of the son of her enemy. The weight of the red book felt heavier than ever. She wasn't ready to forgive, but she was ready to survive. She reached out and gripped his forearm, her fingers digging into his skin. "The truce lasts until the last of them is dead," she said, her voice like iron. "Deal," Vitale replied. "Now run." The cold of the Chicago night seeped through Lucia's thin shirt as they moved deeper into the rusted skeletal remains of the near West Side rail yards. The high adrenaline percussion of the shootout had faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, replaced by the rhythmic clicking of cooling metal and the distant, mournful howl of a freight train. Here, in the shadow of towering grain elevators and stacks of rotted timber, the world felt forgotten. Vitale led the way, his movements fluid despite the dark. He found a gap between 2 decommissioned boxcars, a narrow alley of steel that smelled of old grease and wet iron. He motioned Lucia inside, pressing his back against the cold metal and sliding down until he was a shadow among shadows. Lucia followed, clutching the steel briefcase to her chest as if it were a part of her own body. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the jagged rasp of their breathing. The tension between them was no longer the predatory chase of the restaurant. It was something sharper, a shared vibration of 2 people who had just seen the floor of their lives fall away. Vitale pulled his charcoal coat tighter, the ink on his neck obscured by the gloom, and for the first time, he looked less like a prince of the city and more like a man who was profoundly alone. Rocco was the first person I trusted after my mother died, Vitale said, his voice a low thread of sound that barely carried over the wind. He wasn't looking at her, he was staring at a patch of oil on the gravel. He taught me how to read a ledger. He taught me that in this life, loyalty is a currency you only spend when you're ready to go bankrupt. I just didn't think he'd be the one to collect. Lucia watched him, her eyes adjusting to the dark. The righteous indignation that had fueled her earlier was cooling into a wary, analytical curiosity. He didn't just target you, Vitale, he targeted the memory of my father. He wanted the Red Book, because it's the only thing that can kill the myth of the Matteos. He wants to be the one who writes the new history. She shifted, her shoulder brushing against his. He didn't flinch. In the silence of the labyrinth, the lines that had separated the waitress from the boss were blurring. They were just two heirs to two different kinds of ruins. My father didn't destroy your family because he hated them, Vitale murmured, finally turning his head to look at her. His eyes were dark, reflecting the faint orange glow of the city's distant perimeter lights. He did it because he was afraid. He saw the Valents as the last of the true believers, people who put honor before the dollar. He knew he couldn't compete with that. Lucia felt a strange, uncomfortable knot loosen in her chest. She had spent 3 years hatting the name Matteo, wrapping herself in the cold comfort of her vendetta. But looking at Vitale, she saw the same exhaustion she felt every morning when she tied her apron's strings. I didn't keep this book to destroy the city, Lucia said, her voice steady. I kept it so I wouldn't forget who I was, but tonight, I think it's the only thing that can stop Rocco from becoming a god. Vitale reached out, his hand hovering near hers for a fraction of a second before he pulled back, as if remembering who they were supposed to be. Then we don't just survive, he said. We make sure his godhood ends before the sun comes up. The bond was no longer just a truce, it was a conspiracy. In the belly of the industrial maze, the waitress and the wolf had found a common language that had nothing to do with dialect and everything to do with the shared weight of a crown they hadn't yet claimed. The transition from the industrial decay of the rail yards to the sterile, glass and steel heights of the West Loop felt like crossing into another dimension. Vitale's private penthouse was a sanctuary of cold light and silent shadows, hovering 50 stories above the city. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago looked like a circuit board of orange and white, indifferent to the blood being spilled in its name. Vitale locked the door, the heavy deadbolt clicking with a finality that allowed the adrenaline to finally ebb. He dropped his ruined charcoal coat onto a designer sofa, his movements stiff. Lucia didn't sit. She stood in the center of the vast, open room, the steel briefcase looking out of place against the minimalist decor. She felt like a splinter in a wound, too sharp for this world of clean lines and quiet power. My father doesn't know about this place, Vitale said, gesturing to the expanse of the apartment. I bought it to be a man without a name. It's the only place in the city where Rocco's eyes don't reach. He walked to a sleek kitchen island and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass, his hand finally showing a tremor. The book, Lucia, show me why we're dying for it. Lucia set the briefcase on the marble counter. The sound was heavy, the weight of 30 years of secrets finally coming to rest. She entered a complex alphanumeric code, her birth date and the date of her mother's death, and the latches popped with a dry, metallic hiss. She didn't hand him the book. She turned it so he could see the pages. They were filled with dense, meticulously handwritten entries in a mix of Italian and a cipher her father had taught her when she was a child. But it wasn't just text. Taped to the pages were micro-SD cards, grainy photographs of handshakes in dark parking lots, and bank routing numbers that traced back to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. This isn't just a list of names, Vitale, Lucia said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. It's a surgical map. Your father's empire is built on a foundation of bribed judges and union bosses, but Rocco, he has been the architect of the leaks. Look at the entries from 2022. She pointed to a column of figures. Rocco hasn't just been skimming, he's been redirecting the Matteo protection funds into a private military contractor based out of Virginia. The men who attacked us at the warehouse, he didn't just hire them, he owns them. He's been using your father's money to build an army that could wipe the 5 families off the map in a single night. Vitale leaned over the book, his eyes scanning the numbers. The shock on his face was replaced by a cold, calculating rage. He realized then that the Libro Rosso was more than evidence. It was a detonator. Lucia held the power to end the era of the Dons and replace it with something far more clinical and terrifying, or she could use it to cauterize the wound before the infection took the city. Rocco thinks he's the only one who knows where the bodies are buried, Lucia continued, her eyes locking onto Vitale's. But my father was the one who dug the holes. If we feed this data into the city's secure servers tonight, Rocco is a dead man by sunrise, but your father will go with him. Vitale looked from the book to the skyline, the reflection of the glowing city dancing in his dark eyes. My father is a relic, he said quietly, but he's a relic with a code. Rocco is just a parasite. He turned back to her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first sign of the alliance turning into a shared destiny. We don't send it to the servers, Lucia. We send it to my father. We let the old world settle its own debts. The strategy was set. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were the executioners. In the silent sanctuary of the skyline, the waitress and the prince began to weave a web that would strangle a traitor before he could even draw his next breath. The trap was set not in a dark alley, but in the very place where Rocco felt most invincible, the high-ceilinged, sound-proofed boardroom of the Matteo estate. The room smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition. Rocco sat at the head of the long oak table, his fingers steepled, his face a mask of practiced concern as he looked at the empty chair where Vitale should have been. Across from him sat Don Ricci, his silver lion cane resting against his leg, his eyes hidden behind those impenetrable dark lenses. The girl is gone, Don Ricci, Rocco said, his voice smooth as silk. And I fear Vitale followed her into a trap. My men found the warehouse in the canal district in flames. It's a tragedy, but we must secure the borders before the other families smell blood. Rocco leaned forward, reaching for a folder, but his hands stopped midair. A low chime echoed through the room. On the massive wall-mounted monitors, the live feed didn't show the stock market or the docks. It showed a high-angle shot of Vitale's penthouse. What is this? Rocco hissed, his mask slipping for a fraction of a second. The screen flickered, and suddenly Lucia's face filled the display. She wasn't the trembling waitress from the Gold Coast anymore. She stood tall, her dark hair loose, the Libro Rosso open on the table before her. Beside her, Vitale stepped into the frame, his gaze fixed on the camera and on the man sitting in the boardroom. "Hello, Rocco," Vitale said, his voice booming through the boardroom speakers. "I believe you were looking for this." Lucia didn't waste a breath. She began to speak, her voice a rhythmic, lethal cadence as she scrolled through the digital mirrors of the Red Book. Entry 402, redirect of shipping funds to a private military shell company. Entry 519, the offshore accounts used to pay the hit squad that just tried to execute the Matteo heir in a shipyard. And finally, the encryption keys for the communications Rocco used to coordinate with Valent's old enemies. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Rocco scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching against the marble. "It's a lie, a digital fabrication. Don Ricci, don't listen to a girl who..." Don Ricci didn't move. He didn't even look at the screens. He slowly reached out and tapped a button on the table's console. The boardroom doors hissed shut, the heavy steel bolts sliding into place with a sound like a closing coffin. "The thing about mountain dialects, Rocco," Don Ricci whispered, his voice like dry leaves on a grave, "is that they don't just carry words. They carry the truth of a person's blood. The girl spoke the truth at my table. You've been speaking lies in my ear for 20 years. The old man finally removed his sunglasses. His eyes weren't weak. They were burning with a terrifying, ancient clarity. He looked at the screen, where Lucia stood like a vengeful angel of the old world. "You have the book, little sheep," the Don said to the monitor. "Now watch how a wolf handles a parasite." Rocco backed away, his hands fumbling for the weapon he kept tucked in his waistband, but he was already a ghost. The shadows of the boardroom seemed to close in as the men who had stood guard behind him for a decade stepped forward, their loyalty shifting back to the source of the power. The mask had fallen, and in the cold light of the digital betrayal, The consigliere realized that the girl he had dismissed as a nobody had just dismantled his entire world with nothing but a ledger and a proverb. The roar of the city outside seemed muffled, as if Chicago itself was holding its breath in the wake of the night's violence. 1 month had passed since the boardroom at the Matteo estate had been cleansed of its rot, and the Gold Coast was bathed in the soft, deceptive glow of a spring twilight. At Eleclis, the tables were set with the usual clinical perfection, the crystal polished to a blinding shine. But the air was different. The synchronized panic attack of the staff had been replaced by a heavy, reverent stillness. A sleek black sedan pulled to the curb, but it wasn't a manager who stepped forward to open the door. It was the owner himself, standing on the sidewalk with his head bowed. When the passenger stepped out, she didn't wear a red apron or a uniform a size too big. Lucia moved with a grace that was no longer practiced or hidden. She wore a tailored suit of deep emerald silk, her dark hair no longer pinned in a severe bun, but flowing over her shoulders like a river of ink. She walked into the restaurant not through the service entrance, but through the front doors. The clink of silverware stopped. The whispers of the city's elite died in their throats. Lucia didn't look at her shoes. She looked at the room as if she were inspecting her own gallery. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the sun around which the room orbited. At the center mezzanine table, the same table where the wolf had first tried to mock the sheep, Don Ricci and Vitale were already waiting. As Lucia approached, something happened that made the floor manager's heart skip a beat. Don Ricci, the Lion of Sicily, the man who stood for no one, leaned heavily on his silver lion cane and rose to his feet. Beside him, Vitale stood as well, his eyes no longer predatory, but filled with a fierce, quiet pride. Don Ricci pulled out the chair at the head of the table, his chair. "Everything is to your liking, matriarch?" Vitale asked, his voice low and intimate. The bond forged in the rail yards now solidified into a foundation of a new era. Lucia took her seat, the Libro Rosso resting in a velvet-lined case on the chair beside her. She looked at the menu for a moment before closing it and looking the old Don in the eye. "The wine is acceptable," she said in that same ancient, rhythmic dialect that had started the fire. "But the bread in this city has grown soft. It's time we reminded the bakers who owns the grain." Don Ricci threw his head back and laughed, a booming, genuine sound that echoed off the marble walls like a victory march. "She is terrifying," he remarked to his son, wiping a tear from his eye. "A true valiant. She didn't just survive the wolves, she taught them how to howl." Lucia didn't return to the kitchen. She didn't refill a single water glass. Instead, she raised a hand, and the most powerful men in the city leaned in to hear her speak. The shy waitress who had once trembled over a dropped spoon had vanished, replaced by the Queen of Chicago. She hadn't used a gun to win her war. She had used the weight of her blood and the cold, hard truth of her heritage. As she presided over the table, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was her court. And for the first time in 3 years, Lucia Valent looked at the city she ruled and realized she was no longer hiding. She was finally home. Did Lucia make the right choice by sparing the man whose family destroyed her own, or should she have used the Libro Rosso to burn it all down? Would you have trusted Vitale, or was he just another wolf in a sharper suit? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this ride through the dark streets of Chicago, from the Gold Coast to the rail yards, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale of power and justice. Thanks for watching, and remember, the quietest person in the room is usually the one you should fear the most.